So in this tutorial, we will look to add a new control surface, or two in this case. We first need to unpack the prefab, then we go down to the aero controller component. This element controls all the control surfaces and any parts that might move because of flight info. In here we can see in the list the rudder pivot. If you click on the object, it will scroll you down to the object you select. Within this parent object, you can see there are various mesh items, along with the actual arrows and hitboxes for the rudder. Obviously on the F-117 there are two rudders. You can see here that they rotate along the green axis, which on the local plane is the y-axis. You can also see that the tip rotates correctly around the y-axis, and that the parent group does not rotate along the y-axis at all. Therefore we will need to rotate around the tip, meaning that really we need to create a new parent for the tip mesh. Otherwise we are using the mesh level, and that can cause other problems later. So to ensure we get the correct axis from the tip and not the group, we first create a child object under the tip object. This can be called rudder pivot. We then move the existing tip to be a child of this new pivot object. Now when we rotate around the pivot, it moves correctly. In the model, we can see that the multiplayer Steam badge is located under the tail here. So we need to move that tail out under the actual rudder so it moves when the rudder moves. Okay, so copy and pasting it won't work. This is because when you copy paste, it retains the distance from its parent object, causing it to move. To get around this, we have to move the original object to be under the tip. We just check that moving that around the pivot moves the tail out, and then I will fix the positioning on the tail so it doesn't look weird. Now we go back to the actual hidden rudder, and we will copy the vehicle parts from the original rudder to the new rudder. Then we drag the aero from the original rudder and place it under the pivot. This way the aero will rotate with the rudder rotation. At this point we move the aero to be correctly positioned in line with the rudder. I always point aero rudder y-axis perpendicular to the rudder plane. Then I just update the name of the items to be left or L for left. So the final thing to do with the left-hand rudder here is to add to the new rudder pivot point into the aero controller. So go back up to the aero controller component and check the old rudder. Now scroll to the new rudder and make sure it rotates correctly on the pivot. Then we drag the pivot into the aero controller in replacement of the old rudder. And we just check to see that the y-axis is the correct rotation, and we change the element's rotation axis to y by setting x to 0 and y to 1. I will just move the tail out a bit more. So I will now go back to the original rudder, select all objects under it, and run the maintainer to see if it links to anything else. Here we can see it links to damage sync and player vehicle sync, so we need to replace those. So if we scroll down to the damage sync, which is in the main vehicle components, we can see the old rudder is named in here. We need to replace that with our new rudder. Then we do a similar thing for the net sync. Replace the old item with the new object. Now further down we can see the new right rudder, so we will need to make this look like the left rudder. First we check there aren't any other items we have missed in maintainer before we copy the left rudder. Then we can delete the old rudder objects. So we have to do exactly the same. Create a new empty child to become our pivot. Move the tip under that pivot. Then we copy the vehicle part component from the left rudder and paste it as a new component. Now we copy and paste the aero from the left-hand rudder. Let's drag up the tail art piece from below, then we can position it appropriately. Finally we go to the aero and move that so it aligns with the rudder plane, but we rotate it so that the y-axis points away from the plane. In order for the aircraft to use this control surface, we need to add it as a new item into the aero controller list. So we scroll to the bottom of the list and click the plus to add a new list item. Here you can see I drag in the new pivot to the new item on the list and set the rotational axis with the same settings that the other rudder has. Next I fix up the tail art so it looks better. Then finally, I'm going to add new elements to the damage, sync, and vehicle sync components, and add the right rudder to each of the components. You will notice in this video, I actually make a mistake by not adding the right rudder, instead adding the left rudder. I do fix this later. Then I push the updates to the prefab and export them as an asset bundle. Then after all that, I load up the F117 in game, and you can see once I switch to the camera that I now have a working pair of rudders.